Eben, I emailed you, I said you were a step ahead of me because one of the poems you selected without knowing ahead of time was Ash's poem, Serious Child. So that's probably a good place to start. And Ash, you can save your comments maybe for, you could let the three of us get off track with your poem and then reel us back in. But so yeah, that was kind of just coincidental in the sense of it, kind of aligning with the participant and the poem selected. And it's one, I got a couple of things I'm kind of curious about it as well. So start, Evan, why did you pick it in the first place?
I laughed out loud when I read Your Doubts Can Topple All Kinds of Grown-Ups, and was then immediately curious about how the structure of the poem made that moment happen for me, and then went down the wormhole of its very intriguing, intricate structure. So that was the thing that grabbed me. And I think also as somebody who works with young people and thinks about the power of young people, and knows even at 35 and without kids very well what it means to notice yourself as an old person bringing baggage towards a young person. The sensitivity that the speaker in the poem brings to that was really important to me.
Nice. One of the things I wanted to comment on was the title. And so I think maybe, I think it follows through with the content of the poem so well, but even just as the title, I just had that subjective connection to it because I think I'm safe to say I was a serious child. I like to say the most stressed out grade level for me was second grade. So I think that kind of points to it. So I just kind of had that appeal just from the title of it. So yeah, you mentioned a line. The one line that stood out to me the most was there it is. The line is, "Here is the only rule of make-believe. Choose and trust your collaborators." So in one sense, it kind of has this like this kind of voice of authority, which is kind of funny and fun, even if maybe in the sense that maybe it's coming from a child or coming from a reflection on childhood. And in another sense, I think I relate to it, or it kind of it resonates with me even today. So I don't know, did you have a comment, Ash, on either of those two lines that we picked out first? And okay, go ahead.
I don't know if I have a direct comment coming up, but I feel like it's interesting that both of those lines I think are kind of the more instructional lines in the piece, and I think that there's kind of a collaboration in the piece between kind of these like sense experience lines and instructional lines, and then even this kind of commenter that comes in the italic bits. And so it's just, I guess it's interesting to me that both of the standout lines for both of you were kind of the instructional moments, which I guess feels good because you have to earn those in a poem. Like if you're just gonna tell someone something, you got to earn that. So
yeah, I think that's true. That's probably a good way to put it. And we both have teaching backgrounds, so that's maybe something that it kind of creates that resonance. You know, it's kind of like that voice in there somewhere. Maybe do you feel that way?
Yeah, I think that, and I'm just so grateful that you also brought in Ash. Sorry, the challenge was to choose one line, and that's always like, oh, but there's so much to appreciate here. And the relationship between some of the sensory moments and those more instructional lines is very intriguing to me, as is the italics and the little greater than signs or transformation arrows. With my poetry group, we were actually looking at the poem together earlier today to just like, oh, what's going on? And that was one thing that I was really curious to ask you about. Maybe I'll share what was coming up for me, and then so just as a reader, and then I'd love to sort of hear what you were thinking. Is for these, here is the only rule of make believe. One of my group mates read that as, oh, this is greater than, very much greater than choose and trust your collaborators. And for me, it was like part of this adult starting to edit some of their own thinking kind of partway through. And the fact that those both, like those sort of transformational moments, there's also the, you don't know these words yet, but you'll need them, turns to don't entertain my paranoia like a thought you've never had. It seems like those two sort of framing instructional thoughts are like, oh wait, shoot, that's not quite what I wanted to say, or that's what I was getting from the speaker, was some sort of like editing in process. And then the one that came out just right, and you're sort of like thinking like the one thing that you felt like you could say for sure was, your doubts can topple all kinds of grownups. So anyway, that's what was coming up for me, and I'd love to hear you share a little bit about those greater than or transformation signs.
Is there anything else you want to add to that before I talk?
The only thing I might add is that I think as a reader, I didn't necessarily connect the, what do you call it, the arrows. I didn't necessarily connect it to the greater sign, but clearly it is. I just, maybe that's not the distance between now and taking a math class or something. But it's also, it can be seen as the greater sign, but it's also kind of the causal, maybe just kind of it leads to something, arrow pointing to something. So, I mean, it has this kind of revert, as both of those might kind of be read as opposites, or possibly as opposites. And that kind of does create a playfulness of the poem, which complements the seriousness of it and the speaker, maybe, in a way.
Yeah, I think that this form of these kind of, I think in my own head, I think of them as notations, and like there's something kind of equational about them when they come into the poems and in my manuscript. And they definitely started to happen in moments where I was like, this is another voice coming in. Like, this isn't whatever the voice is that's telling this story. This is some kind of commenting voice in my head. It's not, there's a level of voice change happening. And so as a longtime typographer, this just came kind of intuitively as the solution to that, to communicate like, oh, here's someone else has something to say right now. And the entire manuscript that I'm working in works in this like very kind of spatially oriented style that doesn't really have any other punctuation. And so I kind of came up with my own ways to offset these things. And I think in my intention, definitely having the double arrow there moves it farther away from thoughts of greater than or less than for me. And it's more about momentum, I suppose. Like, if we're here, we're going here, is kind of the way I experience it. But there have definitely been moments in poems where I've toyed with that greater than, less than meaning, and like, am I okay with it being there, and like someone bringing that into it? And so thinking about the order of those statements with that symbol between them definitely becomes important as I'm considering how they sit on the page together.
Aaron, a quick process-related question. Do you guys tend to have the poets read the poem? Because that's one thing that, when you talk about typography and sort of phrasing and voices, if we have time for that, that's something I'd love to hear.
Yeah, sometimes we do, actually, and not even just the poet, but somebody who reads on behalf of the poet. So yeah, if you're up for it, go ahead. I mean, I'm willing to let you do that if you want to. I mean, it's a little bit of putting you on the spot, so you don't have to
It's all
if you
good.
don't
It's all
want to.
good.
But go ahead.
Reading poetry is my favorite thing. So
Okay,
it's
cool.
awesome.
You get, not everybody has that little performative element in there, so yeah, go for it.
All right. Serious child. Move rocks from pile to pile, all business, even if no memory of why. Dig hole on tidal sand, fill with salt water, drip out planet's other side. Here is the only rule of make believe, choose and trust your collaborators. Oh, serious child, your doubts can topple all kinds of grown-ups. You don't know these words yet, but you'll need them. Don't entertain my paranoia like a thought you never had. Hold me and assure some of this, only nightmare. Sort unclear shapes to grok yellow, sound of leaf breathing, what bravery is beholden to. Malleable you be unconcerned with longevity or tying any end down. Cartwheel in invisible wake.
Oh, Ash, what a pleasure. Thank you. And in hearing you read, some places that came particularly alive for me. First of all, this sort of opening scene is one of the only places in the poem where I think I know what I'm looking at. And there's something about the like sort of pathway into this more like unclear shapes and fading that came out somehow in your reading, like the way the sort of internal line breaks start breaking up chunks of words. And one of those sort of like more abstracted parsing line breaks is this one, what bravery is, line break, beholden to. And in this poem, because the lines are so wide, it's like this slog to get back, like visually, to get back to the start of the line. And so like, to me, the line breaks are extra present. Like it's the same with your doubts can topple. I have to like run back and then I like have all this momentum, all kinds of grown-ups. Whoa. I sort of bump into it and hear this like, what bravery is, and then the sort of new commentary beholden to. And that was one of the most mysterious lines of the poem for me. And I loved the mystery of it. To me, I guess one way that I tried to read it or to make sense of it was that there's a bravery that children have for staying in a flow state. This sort of like, oh yeah, this serious child will move the rocks from pile to pile, and there isn't a question of why, and there's not a need to sort of answer the question of why. And to an adult, that is an act of bravery, because adults have to do this. Why am I doing it? And they do that all the time. And that's, how I read this, like, don't enter my paranoia, don't entertain my paranoia. It's like, I hear the speaker trying to like contain the paranoia for a second. But yeah, that line was really interesting. What bravery is. I feel like I started to get some sense of that. And then beholden to, I was like, the poem evaded me. And that's one place that I'm still like sitting in mystery. Yeah.
And I think this is a case too, where the shape of it, I think does, at least it helped me kind of grasp it, which if you see enough poetry that works with, shaping and unusual formatting, that's not always the case. So if with screwy line breaks and shapes and putting margins all over the place, sometimes that's an impediment to the meaning. In this case, I think what works so well is that the shape of it helps me understand it, in the sense of it is so kind of even evenly spaced. Even the sides of it are more or less a square. And the spacing between the words is kind of like shaped relatively evenly. So the word that came to mind after kind of viewing it in a visual sense was equanimity. I don't know if that's like connection in a literal sense. That's just kind of my impression of it, or just it made things seem kind of like there's a calmness over it and an evenness, even though that the content of the poem is not necessarily calm and even. So the format of it kind of gave that impression. So that was a little bit of my 2 cents. And then the only other thing I'll add, and you could tell me if this is just me reading myself into it or if there's something to it, but I felt like this poem had only child energy. And is that anything there?
I grew up with a little brother, but there was definitely like a couple years in actual years, but like a lot more of an experiential gap in the way that we saw and experienced the world. So I do think that like I spent a lot of time on my own as a kid, and I was very curious about that kind of alone time for sure.
Fair enough, fair enough.
I also just want to take this chance to tell you thank you for working with such a difficult form to render on the web. And, just like submitting these poems has been sometimes really pleasurable with how much people want to invest in making them their final form online, and then also sometimes a bear. So I really appreciate like your efforts making that happen.
Yeah. You're welcome. And that's a good piece of advice for listeners. If you're a submitter, like be careful with what you do on the page, because it is that extra extra commitment on the side. This better be worth it. It's better be good in order to go through, not like a ton of extra trouble, but a little bit more than just left margin, single space, whatever. So yeah, you're welcome.